Hello everybody, how are we doing? Verstappen was victorious, Ferrari fumbled, and Tsunoda soared this weekend in Abu Dhabi. So I asked you for your hottest takes from the 2023 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, and let's have a little chat about them. Of course, I am live this weekend for the hot takes, the final hot takes of the 2023 season, although we only started doing hot takes sort of a third or sort of 2/3 of the way through the season, or for the final third of the year. I appreciate all of you kind of stopping by all of those videos every single week. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to put together a full video, but I still wanted to do hot takes. It was a very big, weird balance. If you haven't seen, I did make a video after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, but it was specifically about Max Verstappen, and we'll start by talking about him today. If you haven't seen that video, check it out after this. But Alvaro did say, it felt like the Las Vegas Grand Prix was the real season finale. Abu Dhabi this year was decent, but coming off the back of Vegas, it did feel like a little bit of a letdown. And I have to agree, to be honest. Like, Abu Dhabi didn't quite have the same je ne sais quoi. Like, Abu Dhabi as a spectacle, as a finale, it has really good energy. And even my mum, who is not someone who likes Formula One at all, said that she was looking at some of the pictures from Abu Dhabi and they look incredible. And it does. Like, as a spectacle, it felt like Abu Dhabi was always right on top. Like, it's kind of up there with Singapore in terms of the cars under the lights. You know, it just has that feel about it. But this year, we had the spectacle of all spectacles in Las Vegas. So it did feel like Abu Dhabi was a bit flat. I mean, usually Abu Dhabi looks amazing, but when the cars were under much more exciting and interesting lights in Las Vegas just a week beforehand, it took away from the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix quite a bit for me. Plus, Formula One and the whole grid felt like they couldn't really be bothered with Abu Dhabi. Of course, there's always that end of year down period from all of the teams on the grid. And the fact that there was a fifth race in 6 weeks, like, it just felt like it was simply too much at the end of the year, which makes me really worried about 2024, by the way, where we have 2 triple headers at the end of the year with only a week or so in between, I think. So if they couldn't do 5 races in 6 weeks this time around, 6 races in 7 weeks next year is going to be an absolute slaughter for those guys. I mean, there was a couple of drivers, Esteban Ocon and George Russell off the top of my head, who were also unwell whilst in the car. So that doesn't sound very good either. And even though there were lots of battles and lots of things that still needed to play out in Abu Dhabi, nobody from fans to drivers could really be bothered with going to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix and actually seeing how it played out. Then we have to move on to Max Verstappen himself. I mean, the builder IRL said next season is going to be all about P2 because Max Verstappen obviously will be first at everything. And it felt like this weekend could have been another one of those weekends akin to Singapore, which I know is the only race he didn't finish on the podium, but it did feel like it had that kind of vibe to it to begin with. Obviously, he sat out of free practice 1 in place of Jake Dennis, the Formula 3 champion, but then he also struggled in free practice 2 and in free practice 3 as well. The Red Bull didn't look itself, and Verstappen wasn't massively confident heading into qualifying, but then he took pole position. It was kind of like, they just know how to do it. Like, it's another reminder that this team and this driver in that car, they just make it work when it really matters. And even if he didn't look great in free practice, he looked absolutely perfect when it came to qualifying. And then come race day, considering Max Verstappen has converted every single pole position into a win this year, it wasn't really in doubt. He made it 12 from 12, which is a record in and of itself. And it was just nice to see a little hint of a battle between him and Leclerc at the start once again. It was a lot cleaner than the battle that they had at the beginning of the Las Vegas Grand Prix. But once Max Verstappen got himself out of DRS range, the Grand Prix was basically won from that position. Like, Max put together another incredibly professional drive, held onto his tyres perfectly, even allowing Sergio Perez the better of the pit stops. Like, it was that kind of classic Max Verstappen, I've already won this, so if you want to treat Sergio Perez better than me this race, I guess that's absolutely fine. And then also, I did feel like at the end of the race where he made that little touching tribute to Franz Tost, who's obviously leaving leaving the AlphaTauri team. We'll get onto them in a little while. That was a lovely way to finish. A few donuts as well, of course, at the end of the season. And it's just looking like next season he's going to be completely untouchable again. It does feel like the other teams and other drivers need an absolute miracle to get anywhere near Max Verstappen in 2024. But, you know, here's praying for a miracle. Although, let's move over to the other side of the Red Bull garage, because Ariosto says Checo missed out on getting a lifetime supply of free of Ferrari keychains with that 5-second penalty. And I completely agree. Like, he basically cost Ferrari second place in the Constructor Standings, although could you say it was really the Stewards that cost Ferrari second place in the Constructor Standings? Because Sergio Perez, I think, has a point in that 5-second penalty did feel pretty harsh. Like, the whole thing was a little bit clumsy. Obviously, the Red Bull is so much quicker than the McLaren in a straight line. And Sergio Perez didn't need to go for the move then. I think if he'd have waited another couple of corners, he could have still got past Lando Norris fairly comfortably. But I felt like he had that pressure on him to try and get onto the podium. And I don't know, it was a bit strange, especially to give the penalty when it felt like nothing was really gained because of Sergio Perez coming into contact with Lando Norris. I mean, Norris was able to then cut the next corner, disappear off in the straight, and Sergio Perez made the point that actually Lando Norris probably got further away from Sergio Perez by going off the track because of that little bit of contact. But then at the same time, you have to judge it and you have to give the penalty if the stewards thought, you know, Sergio Perez was in the wrong. He went very deep into the corner, didn't make the apex. It was a weird one. I do think it's quite a harsh penalty though. Although I did think this is the third race in a row now where the optimum result for Sergio Perez just slightly slipped away towards the end. Like Brazil, he lost out to Fernando Alonso on the final lap. Vegas, he lost out to Charles Leclerc on the final lap. And this time, he lost out to George Russell on the final lap, even if it was under slightly different circumstances. Like George Russell didn't take him over, but he did take that podium position from him. And Perez said after the race that he was happy with his Sunday performances this season, especially in the second half of the season, where he did find a little bit more form in the last few races in particular. But I think it's fair to say that of those great recovery drives, even this weekend where he started 9th and finished second on the road, which became 4th with the penalty, his Saturdays definitely need just a little step up into 2024. Instead of recovering, he just needs to qualify where that Red Bull car should actually be. And then I think the race pace is still there for Sergio Perez, most definitely, even if he'll be closer to Max Verstappen. I don't think he'll be on Max Verstappen's level, don't get me wrong, but the second place in the driver standings, the second place in the driver standings should have been completely out of sight a lot longer before it actually was. But back to that 5-second penalty, in the end, it did actually decide the championship, which was really, really strange. Oh, thank you so much, Plans for Cool. I love your videos, if you make them. Because David then said the Ferrari team wall does not disappoint. They can't even go backwards for P2. Of course, hinting that Charles Leclerc tried his best, even though the stewards gave Sergio Perez that 5-second penalty, and Sergio Perez then tried his best to still get 5 seconds ahead of the cars behind. Charles Leclerc then also tried to give the Mexican a little bit of a helping hand. Like, even if Leclerc tried to change the result of the performance, he didn't allow himself to really nick in second place in the Constructor Standings. Like, he did everything that he could. I think some last lap hijinks was attempted, but I think he still remained sportsmanlike in the way that he did it. I mean, as David is saying here, if he really wanted to, he could have parked his Ferrari car on the apex of the final corner and pushed George Russell backwards by a huge margin. But then I also feel like that would have been quite a gamble for Charles Leclerc. I don't think it was just as easy as holding back George Russell, because he had to get that perfect. Because remember, he let Sergio Perez pass, so he needed to be within 5 seconds of Sergio Perez, whilst also making sure George Russell wasn't, and getting that balance of like seeing Sergio Perez cross the line, then trying to judge like 4.5 seconds would have been a really tricky task for Charles Leclerc to do. Because remember, he didn't want to lose that position. As much as it's great for Ferrari to get second in the Constructor Standings, Charles Leclerc would much rather take a second place trophy home, like for him personally. And I suppose the fact that Ferrari miss out on P2 and the fact that they were the only non-Red Bull team to actually pick up a victory this season, not being runner-up in the championship is a little bit of a disappointment to them, but does it matter all in all? Like Fred Vasseur and Toto Wolff were talking about it afterwards. And if you think about Ferrari and Mercedes and where they are, of course, there's the balance between like the prestige and money that you get for coming above in the championship. So Mercedes get a little bit extra money at the end of the year. They get the prestige of saying that they came second this year as well. Whereas Ferrari get the extra CFD time. So it's a little bit like a backup prize for Ferrari. You're still rewarded in a sense for coming towards the top, but being slightly lower down. And I don't know, it's that balance. Like, which would you rather have? The millions of pounds, but both of those teams have infinite money at their disposal. Like the whole reason we brought the cost cap in was to try and stop them from spending 500 million a year. So Ferrari and Mercedes, you know, they don't need that money massively, but then also, is 5-6 runs in the wind tunnel going to be the real difference between Mercedes and Ferrari next year? I also don't think so, considering how close they were. So I think even though Mercedes came out P2 and Ferrari just behind on P3, I think the fact that they were pretty much equal tells you everything that you need to know about this season. Although I did think it was interesting that Footy Edit said Leclerc needs a better team. Massive Ferrari fan, we aren't good enough for him. That Sainz strategy was horrible. And I do think we have to say that Charles Leclerc has had a really lovely resurgence in the second half of the season. And I actually think Ferrari in general have had a really good resurgence in the second half of the season. Of course, there's always been the little Ferrari bits and pieces. Like, there's always going to be things that go wrong at Ferrari. That's kind of where they are. But if you think about the last couple of seasons, for me, I think Charles Leclerc is the only driver that's really got within touch and distance of Max Verstappen. Like, I know he's sort of won the most races. Oh, I don't know, actually. Has he won the most races? Sergio Perez probably pretty close as well. He's right up there with Sergio Perez in terms of races won over the last 2 seasons. I know he didn't get a victory this year, but the fact they started 2022 so well meant that he picked up a couple there. And if you think like wheel-to-wheel battles that Max Verstappen has had since 2022 began, Charles Leclerc is mainly the driver that's been involved with those. And this last chunk of the season has been very impressive from him. I do think Charles Leclerc is still up there as one of the best drivers on the Formula One grid. I know he finishes 5th in the championship, but I feel like he had more unlucky weekends than anybody else. Like, started the season by taking engine penalties as early as the second race. He was disqualified from Austin, the crash in Brazil. Like, there's lots of different areas where you can point to where Charles Leclerc probably should picked up those points that maybe pushed him above Fernando Alonso, because I don't think Fernando Alonso really lost out on many points. I think Fernando Alonso kind of got that 4th place because of the consistency that he showed. Charles Leclerc, if anything, should have been closer to Lewis Hamilton in 3rd place, in my opinion. And then to go on to what Footy said secondly, with Carlos Sainz and that strategy being horrible. Sainz's season really, although he's been very, very quick in this second half of the season, Abu Dhabi was over basically 4 laps into free practice 2 with that spin into the barrier, like turn 3, was it 8 minutes or so into the session, just completely ruined the whole weekend from that point onwards. And then they got it wrong in qualifying. The traffic led to a Q1 elimination, and from there it's like, okay, he's going to have to do something incredibly special from 18th place if he's going to be able to really pick up the points that Ferrari were hoping for from this Abu Dhabi weekend. And then his progress forward was incredibly slow. He went for that really long first stint. He intended to do a one-stopper, but the degradation on the tyres didn't allow him to do a one-stopper, and they didn't switch around the strategy at any point. And I think the fact that Ferrari at the end of the race were hoping on a safety car that was never going to come just kind of summed up their tactical nous this season. Like, we haven't seen that many safety cars in Abu Dhabi ever, really. I know there's a few, but genuinely speaking, if you're one of the top teams and you're preying on a safety car to nab a few points, your weekend's gone horribly wrong. And then moving on just a touch, we then move on to JacobJ, who said George Russell showed their true talent. It does have to be said that as much as Ferrari kind of fumbled it, and Charles Leclerc tried his best, Carlos Sainz had a terrible weekend, George Russell did save the day for Mercedes. I suppose the fact that this is only his second podium in the entire season tells you everything you need to know about George Russell's 2023. It has been a tough year for George, but he saved Mercedes second place in the Constructor Standings, and he can hold on to that tiny victory amongst the 2023 season. He was right there with Leclerc and Norris in the first stint, got a little bit lucky in the fact that he obviously got ahead of Lando Norris because McLaren botched a pit stop, which we'll get to a little bit later on. But then he showed his pace and he kept right up there and he kept that third place position and not losing his nerve when Sergio Perez overtook him on track. I feel like when you're a Formula One driver, even though you know Sergio Perez has got that 5-second penalty, it's easy to kind of outthink yourself and maybe just mess up a little bit, make a little mistake, use your tires too much, and then drop that 5 seconds behind, even though you know you just need to stay within that 5 seconds. But he didn't. He did really well, and he stayed close enough. And I think the fact that George Russell is like the savior on the final weekend doesn't quite tell the whole story of the 2023 season, but Lewis Hamilton massively struggled this weekend in Abu Dhabi. I know it's probably not a track that he likes to revisit after what happened in 2021, but he struggled to make any meaningful progress after a pretty poor qualifying session. I know he ended the season third in the standings, and as I said, if you look at Mercedes, and if they had lost out to Ferrari for second place in the Constructor Standings, the blame would have rightfully fallen on George Russell because he's thrown away a lot more points than Lewis Hamilton over the course of the season. But I would say, uncharacteristically, Mercedes as an entire team threw away quite a lot of points this year, which they don't usually do. But Lewis Hamilton was all over the place in Abu Dhabi and wasn't the triumphant end to the season that he was probably hoping for. And it also made it worse that after the race had then finished, obviously Lewis Hamilton wasn't in the best of moods, but he basically thinks that Mercedes will still be miles off Red Bull come 2024. So at least, he's optimistic about next year. But moving on to McLaren then, as I said, we need to touch upon that Lando Norris pit stop. Nathan said, if not for Norris's 5-second pit stop, Ferrari would have been P2 in the Constructors. And again, it was kind of another thing that went against Ferrari. So many things seem to go against Ferrari over the course of a season, but even in Abu Dhabi, it was a microcosm of just how exactly consistently inconsistent the FIA and Ferrari are in general, and just how it goes that way. McLaren in this case, I think it was just a poor race weekend from McLaren in general. I was assuming that they were going to be Verstappen's biggest threat this weekend, but they ended up nowhere close. And it was another reminder that McLaren's pace is very all or nothing. They're either comfortably the second fastest car on track by a mile, or they're comfortably fifth fastest and there's no in between. They never really battle with the Mercedes or the Ferrari cars. They're either just completely clear or massively behind and nowhere in between. Looking at the race, Lando Norris jumped up into fourth place at the start, then he eased past his teammate in Oscar Piastri, was up in the podium places, and you were thinking, okay, this is going to be another podium scoring position for Lando Norris, another really solid performance from him. And then the two of them, Norris and Piastri, just they could have worked together, and it looked like they were gonna work together to make something happen until they just both slid backwards. And as Nathan points out, that pit stop was a huge turning point for Lando Norris because he lost that place to George Russell and then just didn't quite have the pace. Obviously then had that little bump with Sergio Perez that we mentioned too. Everything that could have gone wrong kind of did go wrong, and it's disappointing that they've ended the season on this note, considering the huge rise that they went through over the course of 2023, and the fact that they came into this year knowing that their car was going to start off being terrible, but actually they really rocketed up. And Lando Norris, as soon as the McLaren was there to give him that chance at podium places, he started picking up podium after podium. He displaced Fernando Alonso for a tiny little while in the Drivers' Championship, but They did still finish fourth in the Constructors' Championship ahead of Aston Martin, I guess. And I guess that best of the rest prize they can still take home. But now they have the pressure really on them as the team to improve into 2024. I feel like moving into next year, it's really on McLaren to be that team to break into that established top three. And then on that note, there's also a lot more pressure on Lando Norris. And for Lando Norris, I feel like it was another weekend that didn't quite go right. Like, the totally real Johnny Cage said, what the F happened to Lando Norris's tyre grip? He just spun out randomly. And the whole weekend was a little bit strange from Lando Norris once again. I mean, he was furious with himself for that turn 13 slide that cost him in qualifying. And again, it was like another one of those qualifying sessions where he just slated himself for qualifying errors after the session. Piastri did a little bit better job than Norris in Q3, but that really shouldn't have been the case. And it was another time where you like look at that Lando Norris performance and take nothing away from Oscar. He has been absolutely brilliant over the course of this season, but Lando should have had the upper hand this weekend and should have been out qualifying his teammate. But it added to that pattern of Lando Norris where he just hasn't had very many good qualifying sessions, and there's been quite a few qualifying sessions that he's messed up now when the McLaren has like seemed ready to battle right at the top end of the grid. And I know he still started on the third row, but it wasn't where he should have been. And maybe things go slightly differently if he starts up there rather than having to make his way up there. I do feel like he probably should have qualified second. I don't think he would have had enough to get pole position, but even so, starting second and fifth can have a big change on what happens in the race. And again, it led to that discussion around when will that first win come for Lando Norris? Why hasn't he got that first win yet? And lots of drivers obviously go through ups and downs in their careers. I think if we look at Lando Norris, this is another season where he has improved. I think if you look at like every 5 to 10 races, he looks better and better and better. His racecraft has improved this year. He's better when it comes to holding onto tires now. I mean, he knows exactly when to go for a move. Whenever I see Lando Norris go for an overtaking opportunity, I trust that he's going to make it more often than not, which definitely, isn't the case for some of the other drivers that are in that same kind of range of Lando Norris, kind of being in the sport for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. I feel like Lando Norris in that kind of chunk of drivers is still one of the best, if not the best in there. But it is that qualifying, is that pressure and dealing with that pressure. I'm really hopeful for Lando Norris, but I would be as a McLaren fan. I think lots of people are quite frustrated with Lando, and I can also see why. Moving on to Honeypon 2799. Yuki was the obvious standout today. Very, very good drive from him. And I have to agree, Yuki Tsunoda really does love Abu Dhabi. And it seems like he's just really quick when it comes to the Abu Dhabi track, more than sort of any other on the calendar. Obviously, that fourth place in 2021, slightly outshone by other things that happened, but he came into this weekend and again was probably that best driver from that, well, definitely the best driver from that group of 8 drivers at the bottom of the drivers' standings, and he showed that actually he was better off than the Alpines as well. So AlphaTauri, a huge floor upgrade coming into this weekend. I thought it was a bit mental that they went for a massive upgrade package, trying to push themselves obviously into 7th in the constructor standings, but spending all of that money with one race to go was a big gamble, and one that didn't quite pay off. Just to finish up on Yuki Tsunoda though, obviously went really long on that first stint. He was the only driver that really made that one stop look like it should work. We got to see him lead a few laps. I think he's the first Japanese driver in a very long time to lead multiple laps of a Grand Prix. And I still think, though, that one-stop strategy wasn't quite the right choice. It didn't work out, dropped him down a couple of positions. He started in 6th place, finished in 8th place. Although 8th place was probably the best that he could have done. Like, he lost out to who? Like, Oscar Piastri, Fernando Alonso, and Sergio Perez. And if you're looking at the AlphaTauri car versus the Red Bull, the McLaren, and the Aston Martin, realistically, Yuki Tsunoda probably should have dropped a few places behind there. But I don't know. For me, Yuki Tsunoda had an incredible, incredible weekend. But AlphaTauri as a team, the reason I'm wearing this is because it's no more. This is going to be a relic now. The AlphaTauri team coming into next year, it's going to look almost like a brand new team on the Formula One grid. Obviously, the AlphaTauri team boss, Franz Tost, is retiring, the second most well-established team boss on the entire Formula One grid. Only Christian Horner has been in a position longer. Obviously, the team is being completely rebranded. We're hearing like Racing Bulls or Bulls Racing or whatever it is. Obviously, the drivers are going to be the same, Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo, but even that's up in the air to how long does Yuki Tsunoda stay? How long does Daniel Ricciardo stay? Who goes where in the future? Like, it feels like everything is massively up in the air. Even the factory is possibly moving from Italy to the United Kingdom to be closer to the Red Bull factory. So, yeah, literally everything about AlphaTauri is going to change. It's effectively like having a brand new team on the grid with a little bit of the infrastructure behind the scenes pretty much already there. But as I said, it's going to be so weird to see how that all plays out with AlphaTauri next year. As an AlphaTauri fan, like, the main reason I started supporting AlphaTauri was because I just absolutely loved the story of Pierre Gasly and the way that he kind of combated his drop from Red Bull to the AlphaTauri team, but then resurged and was, for me, one of the best drivers on the grid, especially that 2021 season. I think of Pierre Gasly in that AlphaTauri and really showing everything he could possibly do. Then when Yuki Tsunoda came in, I just absolutely loved Yuki as well. I feel like Yuki Tsunoda has one of those personalities that really draws you in. He's one of the most likable Formula One drivers on the grid, became like a fan favorite because of his silly radio messages where he was just swearing a lot, but wasn't really his fault because he just learned English from lots of engineers, and unfortunately that's how they talk to one another. Yeah, I really do hope AlphaTauri come back into next season however they are suited and can continue to still make progress forward, because obviously they just missed out on that 7th place in the Constructors this year. Maybe 7th place in the Constructors is there for them next year. Final one, and this is a hot take from me this time around. I think Logan Sargeant just didn't impress when the pressure was on to perform. For me, it was another weekend where it's like, okay, this is the last chance for Logan Sargeant in a lot of different ways at Williams. And although Williams never really looked like a points threat in Abu Dhabi, I mean, even Alex Albon finished down in 14th place. So I guess you could say 16th place doesn't sound too bad for Logan Sargeant. But all the eyes were on him to show something, like show that he has moved closer to Alex Albon throughout the season in one way or another. Just do something to show that you have really taken a big jump forward, even just from the summer break to now. And he still finished, what, 14, 15 seconds off of his teammate. He was beaten 22-0 in qualifying head-to-head this season. And I honestly think that Williams have a lot to think about here, because if you look at this from Williams' perspective, ultimately, the fact that they held on to 7th place in the Constructors' Championship by scoring points on other weekends meant that this weekend didn't seem too bad, and it meant that they've still had a big step forward this year. Like, the Williams team, they still have plenty of work to do, yes, but there's huge signs of progress, and they've been rewarded by their best Constructors finish since 2017. But if you look at how that Constructors performance came together, next season is going to be even tougher. And I feel like the battle for Williams is going to be, you know, that group at the back, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, Haas, are all going to come in and be a lot quicker than maybe they were this season. So they may not be able to rely on the fact that they only have one driver who's actually delivering performances. Like, if AlphaTauri had snuck 7th place at Abu Dhabi, where would the fault have lied? Definitely not with Alex Albon. Alex Albon, comfortably 13th in the driver's standings, picked up way more points than the majority of drivers down in that bottom 8, and kind of carried the Williams team where Logan Sargeant really didn't. And finally then, just to kind of summarize Abu Dhabi a little bit, Chaos said the amount of incidents that were noted for after the race was pretty ridiculous. Like, what if it was Leclerc or Russell under investigation? They could have left that for later. And it does feel like the Abu Dhabi stewards just love being involved maybe a little bit too much. Like, you'd have thought they've learned from 2021 that making championship deciding decisions doesn't really go down well with Formula One fans, but they did it once again by giving Sergio Perez that 5-second penalty, effectively deciding second place in the Constructor Standings, and taking the sting out of the final few laps, in my opinion. Like, I was really looking forward to seeing, like, George Russell doing everything that he possibly could to try and hold on to that third place position, but in the end was kind of handed to him because Sergio Perez was never going to be able to make up 5 seconds in 4 laps or whatever it was. And the chaos that then ensued, and as Chaos has said here, although there were a lot of things they decided to leave until afterwards, I just don't think that's ever the best opportunity. Like, especially when it's something happening quite early on in the race, feels like you should just be able to look at that and get it out of the way before the end of the race, because whenever you finish a race and then the final order is there in front of you, and then that final order is changed a few hours after the Grand Prix, it's just so frustrating as a fan. It doesn't feel nice to say, like, oh, I watched this race, this is the order that I thought happened, this driver was given this trophy, and then actually you wake up the next day or you read some news 3 hours later and you're like, oh, actually they were disqualified, or this changed, or they got a 5-second penalty after the race for something the stewards could have definitely looked at during it. And I don't know, this season once again has highlighted, like, the fundamental issue in Formula One, that the stewards are slightly different each race, and therefore the consistency in decisions is almost impossible to have, like, throughout an entire season. But as we kind of move into the final race and the final hot take of the 2023 campaign, I thought it was interesting to just kind of have a little look at the drivers and constructors lineup, see where everyone shuffled out. I think it's interesting that Fernando Alonso managed to hold on to 4th place. I would have not bet on that coming into the final sort of 5 races of the year, but Charles Leclerc and Lando Norris between them just managed to throw away a few points here and there. Carlos Sainz had a poor weekend. George Russell was never really in contention. The fact that he finished 25 points behind Carlos Sainz, I think, is quite damning for George Russell. But I do think that pack, sort of Hamilton, Alonso, Leclerc, Norris, Sainz, Russell, will be a really interesting battle next year, especially if someone like Oscar Piastri can kind of join that battle a little bit more. Like, you look at Oscar Piastri, finished over 100 points behind his teammate. I don't know if that'll be the case coming into next year, because Oscar Piastri has now done that rookie campaign, and I think will come into 2024 looking a lot quicker than he did this year. And then you kind of look at Lance Stroll. Lance Stroll, I'm actually really impressed he managed to hold on to 10th place. Could have been a hot take around Lance Stroll, to be honest with you, because I think in the last kind of 3 races of the season, he's really come good. There was kind of that middle stint, sort of Canada to Austin, I would say, where he was absolutely dreadful, don't get me wrong, but pre-Canada, he was having a pretty decent season, if not, like, at the level of Fernando Alonso, and post-Austin, I think he's also had a pretty decent season overall, and has kind of redeemed himself a touch, especially after Qatar, where he had a huge amount of controversy around him for good reason. Pierre Gasly beats out Esteban Ocon by 4 points. I think that should have been way more because of how Gasly has been in this second half of the season. Esteban Ocon was definitely the better driver in the first half of the season. I thought was a lot more consistent, but Pierre Gasly really found his feet in that Alpine car. And if anything, Alpine cost Gasly quite a lot of points over the second half of this year. And then, as I said, kind of looking at that bottom 8, bottom 9 with Liam Lawson in there as well. Alex Albon just absolutely brilliant. I think Yuki Tsunoda did warrant that 14th place. I think Yuki Tsunoda was very unlucky at the beginning of the season. Like, picked up a lot of 11th places when that AlphaTauri car looked fairly decent. Then the AlphaTauri car fell off a cliff and he couldn't get anywhere near the points for, like, the middle chunk. And again, they brought, like, a massive amount of upgrades there. And then obviously at the bottom, Liam Lawson, the fact that he came in for 5 races, picked up 2 points, is very, very impressive indeed. Logan Sargent and Nick De Vries are off the bottom here. Logan Sargent did pick up a point, but wasn't in the top 20 drivers, so kind of fell off the bottom. And obviously Nick De Vries was part of the 2023 campaign. Less said about what he did, though, the better. In terms of the Constructor Standings, I think it basically finished how we expected it to. Like, especially once we got to even the halfway point of this season, we kind of knew where everyone was going to pretty much end up. You could say AlphaTauri, maybe a little bit of a surprise package coming forwards. I think Alpine, the fact that they are in a complete no man's land is not great for them going into next season. But then Aston Martin, McLaren, either of those two, can they break into that established top three? They're still quite a way off it. Like, you know, McLaren over 100 points behind Ferrari, and Aston Martin then 120 points off Ferrari as well. So there is still quite a gap for those two to make. But you have to, you know, believe that they can possibly do it. Alfa Romeo in 9th place, Haas in 10th place once again. And generally speaking, just to kind of round out on Abu Dhabi, it was the final Grand Prix of the 2023 season. And by Abu Dhabi standards, we had a bit of championship intrigue. It was a little bit interesting beforehand. It did feel less exciting, as I said, after Vegas the week before. Abu Dhabi usually is a bit of a procession, and nothing about the 2023 race really was much of a surprise. I think, you know, there was a couple of interesting bits and pieces that we've mentioned, but nothing insane happened during the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, and you guys gave it a 3 out of 5. 62% of you voting for it as a 3-star race, and I think that's fair. I think it's an okay Grand Prix, even if it felt like the grid weren't really that bothered about having it. But it does mean the season is over. It means that this stream is over, although we can get to a couple of your guys' questions and bits and pieces that have come up in the chat. Gotta love the consistency of the inconsistency from the FIA. Oh yeah, most definitely. The FIA just didn't really have much idea of what was going on this weekend a lot of the time, did it? My idol. Love your vids. Thank you, Mr. Gedji. Appreciate that, mate. Ferrari were robbed. That is a true fact. I feel like it was a few things that went against them, though, right? Like, they were robbed by the stewards. They were robbed by McLaren. They were robbed by Carlos Sainz not delivering. They were robbed by Charles Leclerc crashing in Brazil. Like, you can go all the way back, and I guess you can highlight where Ferrari and where Mercedes both dropped a good amount of points over the course of the season. Hello, Sally. Lovely to see you in here. Antonio as well. 5 seconds to Checo. Is more than the one. Yeah, that's very true compared to Singapore. It makes it worse that when he was fighting for P4 in the drivers. Yeah, that's it. P4 in the drivers was a weird battle to have going into the final race of the season. Vegas was the best. I was there. Ooh, that's pretty cool crap. Even more amazing seeing it live. Yeah, it did feel like Vegas definitely detracted from this weekend's Grand Prix. But as I said, we are going to finish off the season and finish off the stream. I'd love to know, actually, your thoughts and feelings. Would you prefer these hot takes to be live? Or would you prefer the hot takes kind of videos to be back? Or do you just not watch hot takes? I know that hot takes, like, it's finding a format like post-race that kind of works for me, where we can have a little bit of chat about the race beyond the actual Grand Prix itself. Obviously, we're live for qualifying. We're live for the races as well. We won't be for 3 months, but lots and lots of content coming out. If you haven't seen my Max Verstappen video on all the records that he's managed to break in the 2023 season, and it is a lot of records that he's managed to break over the course of the 2023 season,